Hi and welcome back. If you watched the last tutorial, you'll know that we spent time looking at the basic panel and in particular the tone controls for exposure, highlight, shadows, that kind of thing. And what we're going to do in this tutorial is we're going to have a look at the next panel now, which is tone curve, which on the face of it looks like it does very similar sort of thing. In a simplistic view, you can think of the tone curve as a way of fine-tuning the adjustments that you made in the basic panel. To show that they're doing something different, let's just jump back to the basic panel and have a look at our highlights value, -75. And if we look at our histogram up here, just make a note of where the graph ends. And now jump back into the tone curve. And I'm just going to take the highlight slider, the same thing, and I'm going to pull it down. You'll notice the histogram is actually moving to the left. We're making adjustments to it. But if we look back in our basic panel, our highlights value is still the same. We are incrementally adjusting, if you like, the changes on top of what we set in the basic panel. So they're not the same thing. You'll also see we have actually brought back more detail in the highlights in the actual picture itself. We go back to our tone curve, we just take that back up. You can see that in the clouds here. We're in by default the tone curve simplest mode, which is this parametric curve mode, and that's what gives us these sliders that we can adjust. To get more out of the tone curve though, in this mode and the others that we'll look at, we really need to understand what this graph is showing us. And in simplistic terms, we can think of it as this is our original picture going along the bottom, and these are all the tone values in the picture. The left hand side being black and the right hand side being white. This axis is what we want the tone values to be after we've made our change. If we just reset our line so that we've got a straight diagonal line going through the graph, what it's saying is here the input value of our picture, our original picture, is black, and we want the output to be black as well. We're not going to make a change to it. And up here where we're fully white, we also want the output to be white with no change. And if we were to look in the middle, 50% grey is equal to 50% grey on our final image. Let's look at what happens when we try to adjust the highlight slider. First of all, when I hover over highlights, you'll see up on the graph, up about here, a little highlighted area. And what that is showing us is the areas of the tonal ranges that are going to be affected when we move this slider. So you can see it's right at the top. We're only looking at the bright areas of the picture. We're not going to be adjusting anything in the shadows. And when we take that up, you'll see that it moves the curve up. We'll take it up quite a lot so we can see the effect. We've now got this curve going up here. Let's try to understand what's going on. From about this point here, our new curve is actually higher than the original diagonal linear line that we had going through. So what that means is from around about this point, the brightness on our picture, original picture, we actually want to be brighter on our final image. If you remember, this is our original image, this is our final image. So from here, because this curve is now higher, the pixels at this brightness level on our original image are actually brighter on our final edited images, and we can see that progress up to the top of the curve. Let's have a look at what happens when we play with the shadows. Let's bring the shadows right down, and again you'll see the areas highlighted of the brightnesses that we're affecting in the picture. This time though, because we're below the line up until about this point here, we're saying we want to make any of the tones in our original picture up until about this point darker on our final image. And what we've actually done here is we've increased the contrast of our picture. We've made our darks darker and our lights lighter, and that is essentially what the tone control curve allows us to do, but it allows us to do it in a more specific targeted manner than the ordinary contrast control in the basic panel, and for that matter the highlights and the shadows controllers, that sort of thing. We can smooth out the contrast in the midtones by playing around with the lights and the darks. So let's just take the darks up slightly, maybe bring the lights down a little bit so we get a little bit more of a softer curve. We can also adjust what Lightroom considers to be highlights, lights, darks and shadows with these little carrots here. By default they're set at 25, 50, 75, breaking it up into the 4 regions, but we can adjust those. We can pull them down, for example, if we wanted to, so that we're considering more areas as highlights, less areas as shadow detail. So when we actually change it, then we have much less effect overall on the picture. So again, it gives us the ability to just make very small targeted adjustments to the contrast. The parametric mode is very useful, especially if you're not used to playing around with the tone curve. But what we're going to do is just going to reset this back to its original values, this region, and we're going to flick over into what's called point curve mode, which is this second circle here. You'll see straight away that we've lost our sliders now, and we're just left with this point curve option, which is set to linear, which is this straight line that we're looking at. We've got a couple of options in here. If I jump into medium contrast, you'll see that it's just changed our curve now to give what we call a slight S curve, very similar to what we did in the previous example. It's just increased the contrast slightly by making the darks darker, the lights lighter, but only very slightly. There's not much change. And we've also got strong contrast, which again is still not that strong, to be honest, but you can see a slightly more accentuated S curve. The point curve though gives us even more control, because we're no longer constrained just to 4 regions. We can create as many of these control points as we like just by clicking on the line and adding them in, and we can adjust them, and you'll see it can do some pretty strange things. Let's just reset it to a linear line, so we've got a straight line back, and just see some of the basic things. If I was to take a point in the middle of the line, click on it and then just lift it up, you'll see that the picture overall becomes darker. We've increased the brightness because everywhere now is above our original line, just like in our previous example. So any tonal value here going up is basically being output at a higher brightness because our curve goes above the diagonal linear line, and the more I take it up, the brighter it becomes. Likewise, if I come the other way, my picture becomes darker. Pretty straightforward. We talk about this being the grayscales or the levels of brightness of our original image, but that's not necessarily that easy to comprehend when we're looking at a picture like this. So I'm just going to flick over and pull up a different picture. In fact, let's go for this one here, which is basically a grayscale. So going from white all the way through to black, and we're going to take that into the develop module. And we should be able to see now in much more detail how changing this curve or the points on the curve affect our picture. You'll see now we have the titles input and output. So this is the input brightness level of our original picture, and this is the output brightness level of our edited picture. So at the moment we're saying that if it's black, we want our output to be black, and we can see here we've got our black line. But if I was to take this across slightly, so I'm now saying up to this level of brightness I want my output to be black, you'll see what's actually happened is more and more of our grayscale has become black, and the further I take it across, the more and more of the picture becomes black, because we want more tonal ranges on the input to be output as black. I pull this one back. Likewise here, when I want white, I'm going output as white, but if I was to pull this down, you'll see now that over here it's becoming more and more grey. We're saying it doesn't matter when I'm at 100% white, I don't actually want 100% white output. I'm actually here at around about sort of like 60% grey in fact, and I can bring it all the way down and make the picture completely dark. Let's look at our S curve again. In fact, what we will do is just bring up the reference picture. Let's get rid of that so we've got a bit more space. There we go. So for our S curve, we make our darks darker and our lights lighter. You can see that. And you can see what we've done is we've kind of increased contrast. We've got more bright areas, more dark areas than we have on the original picture. We could go the other way as well. And you'll see now we've actually lessened the contrast. We've got more grey basically in our picture. What you notice is though that as we adjust the point, the line kind of smooths itself out to reach to the next point on the line. And sometimes we won't want to do that because we want to protect more areas. So we can just create additional points. And now when we move this, we don't have quite the same effect anymore going through the curve. Let's say I want to protect my blacks. If I just right click and do reset channel, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a couple of points down here, call it about 3, and you'll see here, nice and black. If I take this curve up now, it gets to the point where it can't go any further basically, but I still have these black areas retained. No matter how far I've pushed it, I've not affected it. Whereas if I reset again, if I take it up this time, you'll see here we've gone much more onto the grayscale. As we keep pushing it over, we get more and more. So we can add points to the line to protect different regions. Say for example we wanted to increase the contrast, but only in our shadows and in our highlights, but our midtones we're quite happy with. What I could actually do is I could create a number of points just around about here, and maybe just about here as well. I like to create about 3 because we've moved the line, it smooths out how Lightroom adjusts it down here when it tries to smooth itself. So 3 control points tends to fix it. And I'm going to put another one up here and another one down here. And I'm going to bring the shadows down, and you'll see here we're not adjusting the middle at all, it's not moving. And I'm just going to take the highlights up, and I'm going to put another point in there, and let's bring this one down a little bit and put another point in there. So what you can see as I adjust these is I'm changing these values here with my curve, and I can change them here on the lighter end as well if we look at the lights. So I'm changing the contrast in the highlights and the shadows using a small localized S-curve, and same here, just a small localized S-curve. But these points here have kind of protected the middle range of shadows. So you begin to understand how adding your own control points you can control smaller regions of your picture's contrast. Let's just look at that the other way. If we reset the channel and we create some points again, maybe about 3 again. There we go. And this time I'm going to put one here and one here. And now what I'm actually doing is I'm changing the contrast, but just in the mid-range values. And you can see I'm protecting the highlights and the shadows because we're only adjusting the bend or the curve in this point here. Our highlights have remained pretty much unchanged, as have our shadows. So that's just looking at it slightly the other way around. Instead of changing the contrast in our shadows and highlights, we're changing it in our midtones. There you go. Let's take a look at these other 3 options up here then. Our red, green and blue. Let's just reset this and let's click over onto our red channel. What the red, green and blue channels allow us to do is a form of colour toning, and this time based on our input brightness values, we're not affecting our output brightness values, we're affecting the amount of red or cyan in this particular channel's case. So for example, if I make a slight S-curve now, what you'll see is I've asked it to increase the blue cyan colour in the darker areas and increase the red in the lighter areas. This is the light end, this is our dark blacks to whites, and we can increase that to have more or less effect. Likewise, if I click over onto the green channel, this time I'm looking at greens and magentas, so I can say in my shadows I want more magenta, and in my lighter areas I want more green, and you'll see that we're affecting the overall tone of the image. On our blue channel we have blues and yellows. Where do these colours come from? Well, it's basically RGB additive colour. If I can follow another image, for example, we have one down here. Try and find the right one. Is this one. Just put a single image on. For additive colour mixing, we have our red, green and blue, our RGB values on computers. And when we mix those values together, we get our secondary colours of cyan, magenta and yellow. So you'll see these actually correlate to opposites. We have blue and yellow. We have green and magenta. And we have red and cyan. just flick back to our grayscale. Color grading is a whole nother tutorial, but let's just have a look at some of the basics of how the colors mix together. I'm just going to reset these channels. I can reset all the channels in one go just by clicking on that, and we get our original grayscale back. Okay, down here I've got a picture of what's known as an additive color wheel, showing how for our red, green and blue the colors mix together. So going from red to green, for example, we go through oranges, yellows to light greens. Then from greens round to blues, we've got light greens, the cyans, turquoise colours, that kind of thing. And then from blues round to reds, violets, pinks, purples. So we can see what would happen if we mix red and green, for example. We would expect to get something in this region of colours here. So let's have a look on our grayscale and actually mix those two colours together. I'm on my red channel at the moment, so I'm going to take it up to about here, and we get obviously our reds and pinks, and we're going to add green to it, and we're going to do the similar sort of thing, and there you'll see that we get that kind of yellowy, orangey kind of colour that we would expect from our colour wheel by mixing these two colours together. Likewise, if we look at what happens between green and blue, if we go back to our grayscale, we've already got our green setting, so we'll reset the red channel, go back to our blue and just change that, and you can see again that we get the kind of cyans and the light blues that we would expect to see on our colour wheel as we move between those two colours. And I suppose just for completeness, if we go back, let's reset our green channel, and this time take our red up, we get our purples and magentas, that kind of colour again that we see between the blue and the reds. If we switch back to our grayscale and we take our greens up to the same value, we get back to effectively our grayscale, because we're mixing all those colours in equal amounts again. Even though we've changed the amount, what we've actually done overall is we've increased the brightness of the picture now. But because we're mixing those colours together, and when we mix all three of them together, we effectively get white, we return to our grayscale. I've jumped over to this picture of a castle taken in Scotland, and we're just going to put some of those tone curve effects into practice. And I'm going to start just by selecting the standard point curve, and we're just going to put a bit of an S curve on it, as we mentioned earlier, to increase the contrast, just to make the shadows darker, brighten up the highlights a little bit. And we're going to go for that cinematic orange and teal type effect. And to do that, what we're going to do is we are going to increase the reds in the shadow area. And I'm just going to put a couple of control points up here to stop my line moving around too much. But down here, I'm going to take up the shadows, just increase the reds. And you'll see it's not having too much of effect on our sky, even when we push it up. So we can get quite a lot of red. And to make that orangey feel, we're going to add in some yellow. So I'm going to go to my blue channel. Again, I'm going to put a couple of control points just up here to hold the line in place. And I'm going to increase the yellows. So now we're getting that kind of orange effect in the shadow area. And what we want to do now for the highlights is we really want to increase the blues. And we're just going to take those up here. Take the blues up, not too much, so that we can kind of get that orange and teal effect. And to get proper teal, we kind of need to add some green in. So if we go to our green channel, again, I'm just going to pop a couple of control points in because I want to hold that, and I want to increase the green in the highlight area to get that kind of more turquoise cyan kind of colour. There we go. There's our before and after. So one last thing to show you just to wrap this up is something called the target adjustment tool. Just come back down here. I'm just going to flick over to our basic tone control, and if you're not sure what area of your picture is a dark or a highlight, you can use the target adjustment tool, which is this little tool here. I just click on it, and what I can do is I can select part of the picture. If I click and hold, I can drag and drop and you can see we get some pretty outrageous results. But you can basically click anywhere, and by moving your mouse up and down you can change those values, so you don't have to work out where on this line a point is. If we want to take the shadows up, for example, you see I just take the shadows up, which is a slightly more natural thing to do. Or these highlights, maybe we want to just bring them in a little bit. There we go. You can see how it's adjusting the curve, and that does work on the red, green and blue channels as well. It does a similar sort of thing. So my apologies if this has been a rather long-winded tutorial this time, but hopefully you've gained a fairly good insight in what you can do in the tone curve. Some people never touch it and they do all their adjustments using the basic panel. Nothing wrong with that. It's something that I dip into occasionally, and I have to admit I don't tend to do colour grading very often using the tone curve, but it's important to see that the functionality is there and how it can be used. So hopefully I haven't bored you too much, and you'll pop along for the next tutorial. Until then, thanks for listening. See you next time.